All right, so you want to dive into some serious stuff, right? Like you're here because you want to understand these big global risks, the kind that could really upend things.
Hmm.
But you also want more than just problems. You want to explore potential solutions.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive. We're going to unpack some pretty dense material, but trust me, it's full of those like hold on what moments that make you see the world in a whole new light.
Even as a kid getting involved in activism, I
Hmm.
remember feeling this weight like, can we actually fix this? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
But the more I learned, the more I realized it's less about finding those simple answers and more about really understanding this complex system that we're all part of. And that's what I find so fascinating about the work our expert does.
They argue that humanity is kind of stuck between two like really bad options. It's like we're being pulled in opposite directions. On one side, you've got this cascade of potential catastrophes, things that could really throw the world into chaos. And on the other, you have these solutions that seem so extreme, they might actually be worse than the problems themselves.
It's a tough spot to be in, right?
Right.
But here's the really interesting part. They suggest that there might be a third way, like a way to navigate this whole mess and actually come out stronger on the other side.
So how do we even begin to wrap our heads around all of this?
Yeah.
Well, we're definitely not going into this with rose-colored glasses.
No.
Our source material is very real about the challenges we face. We're talking about things like climate change, artificial intelligence, bioweapons, you name it, these huge existential threats.
Yeah.
And it's tempting to think, okay, so has technology just made everything worse? But our expert argues that it's more nuanced than that. It's really the scale of the potential catastrophe that's different this time around. And yes, technology plays a major role.
They actually point to the atomic bomb as a major turning point. Because for the first time in human history, we have the power to make the planet uninhabitable. Just think about that for a second. Talk about a wake-up call.
Right? And that realization led to this whole global system focused on preventing nuclear war. And on the one hand, it's been successful in a lot of ways. But
It also created a whole new set of problems. This system, while preventing one type of catastrophe, incentivized unsustainable growth and created these incredibly fragile supply chains. And as we've all experienced firsthand, those fragile systems can lead to a different kind of global instability.
it's like the early days of the pandemic, right? Empty shelves, supply chains, and chaos. That was just a tiny glimpse into how interconnected and ultimately fragile our world has become. And the thing is, it's not just about things breaking down, it's about how the speed of technological advancement makes it so much harder to solve for these risks before they spiral out of control.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes our current situation so different from any previous civilization collapse.
Mhm.
This isn't localized, it's global.
Uh,
And the pace of change is unlike anything we've ever seen.
and the scary thing is, a lot of these risks are like, they're already showing up. We're not talking about some distant future.
Right.
Our expert argues that we're seeing the early warning signs right now, and they're pretty hard to ignore.
Like one example that really got to me was the heat waves in India.
Hmm.
We're talking temperatures getting close to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And I mean, that's not just uncomfortable. That's like literally uninhabitable.
Exactly. And when you have millions of people who are displaced, desperate for resources, well, you see increased conflict, political instability, and yeah, even a higher risk of nuclear escalation. So suddenly, climate change isn't just an environmental problem, right? It's a threat multiplier that affects everything.
It's like all these systems we depend on start to just completely break down. It's like a domino effect.
Hmm.
And it's not just climate change either,
Yeah.
right? You've got this increasing political polarization, the spread of misinformation, bioweapons becoming easier to create. It's like we're surrounded by these ticking time bombs.
And the thing is, these risks, they don't exist in isolation. They overlap, they influence each other, they set each other off in these unpredictable ways. And one of the biggest factors that we often overlook is the role of technology itself.
Okay, so we got to talk about that. Because on the one hand, technology seems like the solution to so many problems. But it's not that simple, is it?
It's really tempting to think of technology as this like neutral tool. Like a hammer can be used to build a house,
Right.
it can be used, as a weapon.
Right.
But it's not really that simple because technology shapes us. It changes how we think, what we value, how we see our place in the world.
It's like that analogy you used about the invention of the plow.
Yeah.
It seems pretty harmless on the surface, right?
Exactly. But think about it. Before the plow, you had all these cultures with these animistic worldviews. They saw spirits in nature recognize this interconnectedness of all things. And then the plow comes along and it fundamentally shifts that relationship. Suddenly, humans aren't living with nature, they're dominating it.
So you're saying it's not just what the technology does, it's how it changes our thinking over time.
Yeah.
And those changes can have these huge unintended consequences.
Precisely. And with the speed at which we're developing things like artificial intelligence, for example,
Yeah.
we might be accelerating those changes without really fully understanding the long-term
So
implications.
we're creating these incredibly powerful tools, but we're also potentially creating new blind spots in the process,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Which makes navigating these global risks even more challenging.
exactly.
But here's the thing, you know, a lot of what makes this so difficult isn't just about any one technology, but how we respond to these challenges as a global community. And this is where I think the idea of the multipolar trap comes in,
Yeah.
which I gotta admit, it sounds kind of intimidating.
Yeah. It can be a tricky concept to grasp, but it's essential for understanding why it's so difficult to solve these global challenges. So, in a nutshell, a multipolar trap is a situation where it's rational for individuals to act in ways that lead to a collectively irrational outcome. No one wins, even though everyone is acting in what they believe is their own self-interest.
Okay, so how does that actually play out? Like, give me an example.
Think about social media algorithms.
Hmm.
On an individual level, it's rational to engage with content that's emotionally stimulating, right? That's how those algorithms are designed. They want to keep us hooked.
Which is how we end up doom scrolling for hours.
Exactly. But the collective outcome of all that individual behavior is a more polarized society, right? We end up flooded with misinformation, and it's harder to have these nuanced conversations and find common ground. So each person acting rationally in their own self-interest is actually contributing to a much larger societal problem. That's the multipolar trap in action.
So it's like we're all stuck in the system, kind of reinforcing the very things that might be detrimental in the long run.
Mm.
And if we know that these traps exist, how do we break free? It can be kind of mind-boggling, right? Like we see how easily we fall into these traps, and it's almost like we're hardwired to make choices that undermine our own best interests.
It makes you wonder, can we actually break free from these patterns, or are we destined to mess things up?
It's a question that's been around forever, right? Like some people say what we need is a strong leader, someone who can make those tough decisions and steer us away from disaster.
So like a global benevolent dictator?
Kind of. But the problem is power, even with the best intentions, can corrupt. And even if we could find a leader who's immune to all that, we still have to contend with what are known as hyper agents.
Right. The hyperagents. We talked about them earlier, but remind me what that means again.
Basically, it's an individual with a huge amount of influence. Someone like an Elon Musk or a Xi Jinping. They can move markets, shape global narratives, even alter the course of entire nations.
So you're saying even with this like perfect leader, these hyperagents would still be out there operating by their own rules, potentially throwing a wrench in any attempts at global coordination.
Exactly. And don't forget the whole idea of centralized control, even with good intentions, can easily turn dystopian, right? We need solutions that are decentralized, but still coordinated, capable of tackling these global risks without resorting to authoritarianism.
Which, let's be honest, sounds like a pretty tall order. But I know you don't just leave us staring into the abyss of despair. You offer some glimmers of hope, some potential pathways towards what you call a third attractor civilization.
Right. And one of the most interesting and perhaps counterintuitive paths is through radical transparency.
Okay, that's interesting. Because you'd think in a world with so much geopolitical maneuvering, transparency would be a liability, not a solution. So how does that actually work?
Well, look at Sweden. Their military operates with a surprising level of openness. They publish detailed information about their capabilities, their deployments, even their weaknesses.
Why, really? That seems completely counterproductive.
It might seem that way at first, but this transparency actually makes them a less appealing target.
Yeah.
By removing that element of surprise, they make it harder for adversaries to exploit any perceived weaknesses. It also fosters a sense of accountability, both domestically and internationally.
So it changes the incentives, right? Instead of a race to acquire more weapons and hide your weaknesses, everyone's encouraged to be more open and cooperative.
Precisely. And while Sweden's military is just one example, it points to a much larger idea. What if instead of operating from a place of secrecy and competition, we found ways to be more open and collaborative, even when it comes to these big global risks?
It's a radical idea, but I can see how it could potentially break us out of those multipolar traps. Instead of everyone acting in their own self-interest, maybe transparency encourages us to act in the collective interest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this principle of transparency, it's not just limited to geopolitics. Imagine a world where education is redesigned from the ground up, not just to give information, but to cultivate critical thinking systems, thinking, ethical decision-making,
Yeah.
the kinds of skills we need in a world that's becoming more and more complex.
It's like that old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. But instead of fishing, we're talking about giving people the tools to navigate these complex global challenges.
Right? Exactly. And with the rise of artificial intelligence, we might actually have the tools to do this at scale. Imagine every student having access to personalized AI tutors drawing on the wisdom of the greatest minds throughout history. Not just learning facts, but learning how to think.
Now, that's a future I can get behind. It's not about finding the right answers, but about giving people the tools to ask the right questions, to think critically and creatively about the challenges we face. And on that note, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's a lot to process, but I hope you come away from this not with a sense of despair, but with a sense of possibility.
Because as we've heard the wisdom we need to navigate this moment in history, it is within our reach. It requires us to rethink our assumptions, to challenge the status quo, and to embrace complexity. So as you go about your day, I encourage you to keep asking those big questions. What role do you want to play in shaping a better future? What seeds of wisdom, courage, and ingenuity can you plant today to help us move towards that third attractor, towards a civilization that's not just surviving, but thriving? Until next time, keep diving deep, my friends.